Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry about the delay. We were just having a little conversation about how the sort of campus feels here, and the campus we used to have across the street, and it was a little kind of a walk down memory lane, I guess, if you will. But sorry, we're a little bit late signing on here. So Michelle's here. Good morning, Michelle. And Adon is here. Good morning. Good morning, Adon. Irene is here. Good morning to you. And Basil's here. Good morning. And yeah. Okay, let's jump back in here. So, pardon me. Yesterday we started talking about Greece, right? We left China behind and we moved into the Greek world. And one of the things that we pointed out pretty quickly was that the Greek world of the past is not entirely the same as the country of Greece, right? So the country of Greece that we know today is kind of the blue part and the gray part and maybe a little bit of the yellow part, right? That's the modern country of Greece. But in the past, the Greeks kind of spread out across the Mediterranean. They were very active sailors, and so they sailed out all throughout the Mediterranean and set up they created little settlements all throughout what's now Greece, what's now Turkey, this land that was called Thrace in the past, and kind of in southern Italy as well. And so they were kind of all spread throughout the Mediterranean, trading and living and kind of, sharing their culture with people. And so I think it was Herodotus who says that, the Greeks were clustered around the Mediterranean like frogs around a pond. Right? So they're all kind of sitting there all along the shores. We said that the country itself is kind of different in terms of a setting for a great civilization, because lots of the civilizations we've talked about already have been river valley civilizations, right? The Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Indus River Valley, the Yellow River, all of those are river valley civilizations. But Greece is different because it doesn't really have a great river valley in which people start to farm around. It's a really kind of rocky, mountainous area. You can still farm there, but not quite like you can in Egypt. And Greece kind of matures as a bunch of little independent city-states rather than a single kingdom that is growing its own food. And so, again, it's kind of a different place in terms of an ancient civilization. We said that in terms of subsistence, the Greeks did farm, but they also did a lot of fishing. They grew lots of olives, which they could, of course, eat, but also create olive oil from. Does anyone like olives? Just eating olives? Don't like them? Yeah? Olives? Number one? I don't like them that much. I like olive oil, and I like olives on pizza, but I get it. Well, there are actually quite a few. Like if you go to Bosa Foods or someplace, you'll see there's like an entire case of olives, right? And they're all different, I think. I don't know.
I think that's what you are.
You think I'm eating something? I don't know. I'm not a huge fan. I like the oil and I like them on my pizza, but I'm not a huge fan of olives. But anyway, the Greeks were, right? The Greeks ate lots of olives, made lots of olive oil, sold and traded lots of olive oil, but also kind of grew their own crops. Some of the crops that we're familiar with, like wheat and barley, the Greeks grew those. Did lots of fishing, did lots of herding as well, right? So the mountainous Greek landscape is really good for herding animals. So sheep and goats, can be raised there quite easily, and you can make cheese and yogurt from the milk, which is also yummy. We said that the Greeks didn't have a lot of resources, but they did have some metal. Later they would find some silver, which we'll talk about with the Athenians, and also lots of clay with which they made these fabulous clay pots. I used to have a video on them, but I don't have them right now. But as it turns out, the shaping of these pots is one thing, right? So you make them out of clay. But firing them, so putting them in the kiln, in the heat, firing them in order to sort of have these two colors come out is quite a process. So it takes a long time. You have to have the temperature set just right, and you have to be able to add oxygen into the kiln at the right time, and then shut off oxygen to the kiln at the right time. That's what allows some of the colors to go black and some of them to go red and things like that. And so you have to know how to make the pot, then you have to know the right things to paint on it, and then you have to know how to fire it correctly. And keep in mind, this is a time where you have to keep the temperature right and you have to have the timing right. And this is a time in history where thermometers and clocks have really not been invented yet. So the Greeks became really good at firing these pots in a way that gets the red or the black colors to come out. And I don't know, I guess this is a personal opinion thing, but I think they're quite beautiful, and they show up in museums all around the world. And you often see red figure and black figure pottery. And so the black figure here is on the left because the people are colored in black. Here we have red figure pottery in which the figures are red. Just different styles. Is it metal? Okay, we said there's kind of a few periods of Greek history. We're just going to look at, very briefly, we're going to look at the Minoans and the Mycenaeans before we kind of move on to archaic and classical Greece, because that's like the real ancient Greece that people kind of know and love. After that, again, the Greeks will be conquered by the Macedonians. They'll fall under the rule of the Romans, and they kind of won't be independent again until they get their own country in the modern world. So we started out kind of around, I guess, 5,000 years ago with these 4,000 years ago with the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. And we said the Minoans were a Greek culture living on the island of Crete. That's that green island right there, Crete. And then the Mycenaeans lived on the mainland, in the purple area. Again, the Bronze Age is called that because it's an age in which people are working and using bronze. And again, these were civilizations that had centralized political and economic control by some sort of king. We're not really sure. And we have writing from that period, but we aren't able to read it. And I think for some reason I thought we weren't able to read linear A, but we were able to read linear B, but I'm not even sure about that anymore. I think I might have been wrong about that. If somebody wants to Google it, I'd be happy to hear the right answer. Whether we have deciphered linear B script from Bronze Age Greece. So here's the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. It was the home of the Minoans. The Minoans had a civilization there which was marked by a lot of palaces and tombs and shrines to gods. So we have a lot of archaeological evidence for the Minoans, but again, we don't really have any written evidence for them because we can't read their writing. So we know they were living in big palaces. We know that they probably had a centralized economy, but it's hard to kind of know what they were thinking and feeling and what was going on. Did anyone look it up? No answers yet? What's that? Whether we can read linear B from Bronze Age Greece.
Yeah.
We can?
It's read from the left to the right.
Okay. But we know how to read it? So, okay, so it's just linear. Maybe it's just linear A that we're not entirely sure of. This is the palace, the big palace on Crete at Knossos. Kind of looks like this now, but in the past it was probably quite a large palace structure, right? So there's some sort of power here, whether it's a king or it's probably a king. But again, we don't know too much about it because there's no writing, okay? Writing looked like this, and so again, if you know if you know what ancient Greek looks like, ancient Greek looks nothing like this. So this is an earlier form of writing that isn't really connected to ancient Greek or modern Greek. And again, it's not one that we're able to read. Yeah. Well, one is used by the Minoans and one's used by the Mycenaeans. And so different cultures use different scripts. It's possible that they were speaking entirely different languages or languages that were related to each other but somewhat different. But again, I don't think we're entirely sure about that either. Because a writing system and a spoken language are sometimes different, right? So, you can write Polish in English lettering, but it doesn't mean they're the same language. So here we're not sure if they were two different written scripts or two different languages. We can't really read that one, and so we don't really know. Don't know what's going on. Did you find anything, Mulder, or no?
Many and Greek documents can be read today. Some features of the writing system remain unclear.
Okay, so part way. You can part way understand it. Okay. Right. So one of the things that we kind of think about the Minoans is sometimes we have this sort of stereotype about them as this kind of nature-loving, carefree kind of people. And part of the reason we have that idea is because of the frescoes that are on their walls. And so fresco is where you put plaster over a wall and then you paint some artwork right on the plaster. And so here you have a couple of young boys boxing. Here you have some people maybe dancing or in some sort of party or procession type thing. There's lots of nature scenes from this culture as well, monkeys and dolphins and fish. Some walls are covered in flowers and sort of nature scenes. And so again, we kind of have an idea of the Minoans as this sort of nature-loving, carefree civilization. Now, whether that's true or not, questionable, but that's how people like to think of them because of the artwork. And here I said there's also kind of maybe I'll just turn that down. There's also kind of something going on with bulls in the Minoan civilization, because we do see lots of representations of them on walls here, and maybe some sort of bull jumping sport, which is the craziest thing I've ever heard of, but the Minoans may have been doing this bull jumping thing. And again, we see, pieces of art like this. I think it's bronze bull head. So again, we're not really sure about the importance of the bull, but it seems to have been something important for the Minoans. And later it gets worked into myth, right? So there's a king in the myth. There's a king Minos of Crete who, as we talked about yesterday, his wife gives birth to this half bull, half man creature, and that's eventually killed by Theseus here. This is Mycenae. So the Mycenaeans are on the mainland of Greece in the Bronze Age. They come along a little bit later than the Minoans do. So the Minoans are a little bit older. The Mycenaeans come a little bit later. And the Minoans we have a lot of archaeological remains from these kind of hilltop fortresses. And so here again, this is Mycenae, I think. And you can see they built the city on top of a hill. It's got defensive walls, suggesting that maybe they feared attack. They needed some reason to defend themselves. And so you can actually go to Mycenae and you can walk around and see what it's like. It's made with these really big stones, which the later Greeks actually thought that the city was created by giants, because the stones are actually so large. And they've kind of been lifted into place. This part's known as the Lion's Gate here, because you can see the two lions over top of the gate. There they are. This is kind of what the ancient city would have looked like. Again, we're about 4,000 years ago. It's not the only Mycenaean city, but it's probably the most popular one. And you can see there's a palace and there's lots of streets. There's kind of a cemetery here, I think, this little circular feature here is some sort of place where kings or rulers were buried. Again, we don't know a huge amount about the Mycenaeans, but interestingly, we do have an impression of the Mycenaeans as more warlike, because in the tombs of those rulers, which we've excavated, oh, sorry, this is their linear B script, which I guess we can read to some degree. In their tombs, we find lots of weaponry, and so kings like this king here would have been buried with a gold mask over his face, but also with lots of swords and shields and things like that. And so we kind of have this, we have this idea of the Minoans as this like peace-loving, nature-loving, hippie kind of culture. And then we have an impression of the Mycenaeans as this warlike, savage group of people. Neither of those ideas is probably entirely true, because again, we don't know a lot about what these people were like because we can't read all of their writing. So, but again, we, in popular culture, we've kind of imagined these two groups as, stereotypically in that way, but it's probably not that true. This is a pretty famous artifact here because it's called the Mask of Agamemnon. And so the guy who discovered Mycenae, his name was Heinrich Schliemann. And Heinrich was convinced that he had read the two epic Greek books, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Have you heard of these two? Iliad and the Odyssey? They're probably the oldest works of literature from ancient Greece. They're written down probably in about 700 or 800 BC, so about 2,800 years ago. And they're very long, they're epic poems. They're basically novel length. And in one of them, the Iliad tells the story of the Trojan War. Have you heard of the Trojan War? Okay. Tells the story of the Trojan War. The second one is the Odyssey, which is a story about one of the Greek generals, Odysseus, and his attempt to sail back home to Greece, to Ithaca, his city of Ithaca. So there are these two books, and Heinrich Schliemann, an archaeologist in the late 1800s, he thought that if you read the book, if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey carefully, that you could actually find these cities. And so he carefully read these books and shockingly found Mycenae and found Troy. Troy is the city that the Greeks siege in the Trojan War. So he actually found both of these places, which you can never really do. You can never really look at ancient myth and connect it to the real world that way. But shockingly, he manages to have done it. But anyway, he found this city, and in the city of Mycenae, he excavated one of the tombs and found this mask. And he said, "Oh, I'm looking at the face of Agamemnon." And Agamemnon is a king, a character in the Iliad. It's probably not Agamemnon, but that's what he called it. That's what he thought he was looking at, and so it's still called the Mask of Agamemnon. It's probably not Agamemnon, but Heinrich Schliemann thought that it was. But still, shockingly, he found the city and he found Troy, which, again, you can't normally do that with ancient myths, but he managed to do it. So there were these two civilizations that were occurring in Greece, right? The Mycenaeans and the Minoans. And interestingly, it seems at one point that the Mycenaeans actually conquered the Minoans. And we're not entirely sure about this, but what happens if you look at the palace records from the Minoans, if you look at the palace records from Crete, they're writing in Linear A, which is their written language. So they're writing in Linear A, and then at one point they start writing in Linear B. And so imagine if archaeologists, were excavating through the ruins of Vancouver in 2,000 years, and they find that we're writing in English, and then one day we just start writing everything in Mandarin. Right? Kind of suggests that the Chinese are now in charge, right? And they want everything written in Mandarin. And we think that's what was happening here, is that the Mycenaeans conquered the Minoans, and then they started keeping records in the Mycenaean language, not in the Minoan one. So it seems like the Mycenaeans might have conquered the Minoans at one point. But eventually both of these civilizations collapse. And we're not entirely sure what happened. It could have been climate change, like we've seen happen in the past. Also, what seems to have been happening at that time, do my slides mention it? No. There also seems to be these sea peoples running around the Mediterranean, and we're not entirely sure who these sea peoples are, but they seem to arrive in ships, in boats, and they would run ashore and lay siege to these towns and kill a bunch of people and steal things and then run back to their boats and sail off. And so we're not quite sure who these sea peoples were, but they seem to have been moving around the Mediterranean at this period, terrorizing, the settlements in the area. Kind of, imagine them as if they were the Vikings. They're not Vikings, but they were kind of doing the same thing, right? Raping and pillaging. And so it could have been some climate change. It could have been these sea peoples. It could have been some other things too, but for whatever reason, these sort of Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations kind of collapse, right? So instead of centralized political and economic activity, everybody kind of, spreads out to the hills and does their own thing. So there's really no economic or political centralization. People are just kind of living their lives, in a much more simple fashion. And so this is the Dark Age, or the Dark Ages for Greece anyway. Not to be confused with the medieval Dark Ages, which come much later in Europe. But the Greek Dark Ages, it's a period of about 400 years or so. Political and economic centralization kind of collapses. People forget how to write. Probably not many people knew anyway, right? Most of the ancient world is illiterate. And so the few people who knew how to write kind of forgot how to do it. And so it's dark because we don't really know what's going on, right? Nobody's writing anything down. Archaeological remains are much harder to find during this period. And so we don't really know, right? It's kind of a period of darkness, a period of who knows what's happening. Until we get to the Archaic period. And this is a period where Greek culture starts to kind of coalesce again. It starts to kind of come together and reform. And so we start to see people writing things down again, not in linear A or B, but in ancient Greek, which we come to know later on. We see the first kind of polises, the first polis starting to appear. We see the first kind of feeling that the Greeks are part of something as a culture, right? They feel that they are a people, right? Not Mycenaeans, not Minoans, but there's something that connects all of these people as one, right? We see the first stories getting written down. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are both written down in this period. The stories are probably older than that, maybe hundreds of years older than that, but they are finally written down in the Archaic period, and then we can actually read them. Did anyone see that movie Troy with Brad Pitt? First little bit of it? Oh, the trailer. Okay, yeah. That movie is based on the Iliad, right? So Brad Pitt is Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, or one of the heroes of the Iliad. But anyway, that book gets written down at this time. The first Olympic Games happened during this time, and so there's kind of a flowering of Greek culture, if you will. This is kind of the beginnings of ancient Greece. That idea that I talked to you about, or the idea I just mentioned, that idea that the Greeks felt that they were a culture, that's called Hellenism, or Pan-Hellenism. So the idea that the Greeks were a people, right? They were a culture. They were the same, even though they lived in different parts of the Mediterranean, even though they came from different city-states that had different kind of laws and organization. felt they were part of something bigger. And the first Olympic Games in 776 BC kind of speaks to that, because people from all the Greek city-states could come to the foot of Mount Olympus and compete for glory, right? The best athletes from around the Greek world could come and compete. And if they won, they would be able to wear a wreath around their head, and they would get to brag that they were a winner in the Olympic Games. No medals yet. Medals, bronze, silver, bronze, and gold medals come way later. At the time, all you get are bragging rights and a wreath. Yeah. Okay.
The archaic period, you said the earliest period of
It's when people start writing things down again. Yes. So there's that dark age where nobody's writing anything and we don't know what's going on, and then when we sort of transition into this archaic period, that's when people start writing again, and we can start to read and understand what's going on. Yes.
How about the Mesopotamian?
Oh no. Well, that's different. I'm just talking about Greece itself. Yeah. So the Minoans and the Mycenaeans were writing things down in the Greek Bronze Age. Those civilizations collapsed. People forgot how to write linear A or linear B, or just stopped writing things down altogether. And then in the archaic period, we see people in Greece starting to write again, but in a new script now, in ancient Greek.
Also, you said that the Mycenaeans conquered the Minoans?
The Mycenaeans conquered the Minoans, yes. Yeah, we think so anyway.
Yeah, so you said Mycenaeans. What with script A?
They had B. They had B, and the Minoans had A, until the Mycenaeans conquered them, and then all of the Minoan palace records are in linear B. Did I switch it? Okay. Very possible. So I think, yeah, so linear A belonged to the Minoans, linear B belonged to the Mycenaeans, but we assume the Mycenaeans conquered the Minoans because the Minoans start writing in linear B. Okay. Sometimes I get confused. Right. So all of this stuff, all of this kind of, the early pieces of Greek culture seem to be appearing during this archaic period. So this idea of Hellas, this idea of sort of a Greek culture that exists. And interestingly, the Greeks didn't call themselves Greek at the time. They called themselves Hellenes. That was the term they used to identify themselves. So the word Greek and the label Greek comes much later. The ancient Greeks would have called themselves Hellenes, and so this is the Hellenic world, if you will. Yeah, I have a map in there. We read about these polis or polises we read about them yesterday, and these start popping up in the archaic period too, right? So little independent city-states that consist of a walled city. Usually there's some land around them that they control, and they have citizens, right? So people are citizens of a city-state. And so people, it's kind of not like Canada today, where people, move from city to city. It's kind of like you had a much stronger belonging to your polis, right? And again, every polis was a little different. Every polis had its own kind of gods that it worshipped. Every polis had its own laws and rules. Every polis had its own unique way of governing itself, right? So these weren't, like here in Canada, if you go to Regina, Saskatchewan, or if you go to Edmonton, Alberta, they're not really that different. They're pretty much the same. But if you went to, in the ancient world here, if you went to Athens and then you went to Sparta, they are totally different city-states, right? It's not like today where Regina and Edmonton are, the same thing. These are totally different ways of living, almost in some ways totally different cultures. So each polis was a very unique. It was a unique animal of its own. I think the idea of a country is that it's actually takes up a geographically large piece of land, whereas the city-states were basically just the city, and sometimes they had some influence or control of the land around them. But mostly the entire state was within the city walls, for the most part. The Vatican is a country. It's probably, in a way, it's probably more of a city-state because it is just a city. But maybe. It's a good question. It's a good question in terms of how we define a country in the modern world, and why the Vatican is a country onto itself, but really is just, it's not even really a city, right? It's a city within a city. The Vatican's pretty weird, though. Well, in that regard, I'm not. Catholics don't shower me with comments, but it's weird because it's its own little city within a city, but is somehow a country. So these little policies start showing up. Again, they're all unique, they're all different, and people have a strong kind of allegiance to their city-state. I mentioned that there were basically three types of city-states, or there were a lot of different city-states, but they had basically three forms of government. And so I just wanted to mention them quickly before we go any further. Monarchies, oligarchies, and democracies. Okay? So monarchies, I think we kind of have already talked about this. Very common in the ancient world. You have a king, right? And usually the king is someone who has conquered the territory with military might, right? He's gone in with his army and his swords, cut up all his enemies, threatened everybody else, and has achieved power that way and crowns himself king, right? Sometimes those kings are hereditary. So the title of king gets passed down to the king's son and then his grandson and so on and so forth, unless there's intrigue and assassinations and games of thrones and all kinds of things, but usually those things get passed down. And again, monarchies are autocratic, right? So whatever the king says, that's what we're doing, right? The king has full power and full authority. The other thing we see in, and that's what we see in kind of northern Greece and in Macedon. Okay, so we see most of the Macedonian city-states to the north of Greece. Those are all kingdoms. Those are all monarchies. Some city-states are ruled by oligarchies, and oligarchies are organizations where the power of the state rests with a group of people. Okay, so you might have a group of people that are, the most noble or the most wealthy, or it might be a group of holy people, or it might be the best warriors, or who knows, but you have kind of a small group of people who are responsible for running the state. In Sparta, they had a group of, Sparta had two kings, actually, interestingly enough, but they were mostly military kings, and so the sort of running of Sparta itself was mostly the job of these ephors, is what they were called. And so there was a small council of ephors, and they ran the sort of day-to-day, affairs of Sparta. And the two Spartan kings were only for military conquest, and they kept two kings so that one could go off to war and one could be at home to defend Sparta. And so they always had two, just in case one was killed in battle. So that's oligarchy, a group of people. And then finally you have democracy, shockingly. Again, you probably know that democracy is a situation where the power rests either directly or indirectly with the people, right? And the people either vote on things directly in a direct democracy, or they elect people to vote for them. That's a representative democracy. So here in Canada, we have a representative democracy. We elect people and we send them to Ottawa to vote for us, right? Those are what the members of parliament are supposed to do. They're supposed to vote on our behalf because we're all busy here. You know, we don't have time to vote on every last issue that faces Canada, right? The ancient Greeks, or the Athenians particularly, they had a direct democracy because, of course, their city-state was much smaller and much less complicated. And so the Athenians voted on basically everything, right? Should we build a new road? Yes or no? Should we go to war with Sparta? Yes or no? And so all kind of male citizens of Athens would actually directly vote in all of these issues. The story by which democracy comes to Athens is kind of interesting, and we'll get to that later. But it is worth noting that, yes, they have a democracy, and it's really it's the first of its kind in the ancient world. And it's definitely worth mentioning because it has such a major impact on later countries, right? Particularly the French Revolution is heavily inspired by Greece and Rome. The United States, Canada, Britain, all of these countries kind of look back to ancient Greece for the roots of their democracy. And the roots of their democracy is right here in Athens. Right, so I've got some stuff for you to read, but first, let's take a little break. Then we'll come back. We'll read about hoplite phalanxes and gods and oracles. Whoops. It should be. Okay, and we are back. So I've kind of brought us through very quickly from Bronze Age Greece from to the Dark Ages and then into archaic Greece, where things start to really kind of pick up culturally, and also, it's a period where we actually know something. And we've probably seen that happen before with the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians versus, say, the Indus River Valley civilization. The ability to read the writing has a lot to do with how much we know, right? And so with the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, it turns out that we just don't really know that much about what they were doing and what was going on with them. And certainly in the Dark Ages, when people weren't writing anything at all, it's kind of anyone's guess, right? But once we get to the Archaic period, people start to write things down. They write in a language that we understand, and then we can start to hear their thoughts and feelings and things that they were doing, right? So we said that this is a period in which this sort of pan-Hellenism feeling comes about, right? These Greeks start to sort of see themselves as members of one group, of one culture. We see lots of little city-states, little polises, polis, I guess I should say, little polis popping up around the Mediterranean. Greeks are kind of setting out and sort of setting up colonies all throughout the Mediterranean. Things are getting written down, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Greeks are coming together for the festival of Zeus at the foot of Mount Olympus, and as part of that, they're engaging in these Olympic games. That's why they're called Olympic. They were held at the foot of Mount Olympus, which was the home of the gods and the home of Zeus. And so, what's that?
Something great in Olympic.
Something.
Yeah, Olympics.
Yeah, comes from Olympus, right? So yeah, all these things are kind of starting to happen as we get into Archaic period Greece. And so I have a short section for you to read here on just a few little building blocks of the nature of these city-states. So a little bit about a hoplite phalanx, which is probably a strange set of words, but we'll figure out what those are. We'll talk about we'll read about the major gods, and then we'll talk about cults and oracles in Greek religion. But I'll give you some time to read through that and answer the questions, and then we'll talk, okay? All right. Let's read. Okay, ready, shreddies? All right, so these are two very strange words, hoplite and phalanx, but what is a hoplite phalanx? Yeah, the phalanx is a fighting formation, and the hoplite is a what? Yeah, that was what you called a soldier, right? A Greek soldier from a city-state. And so all of these hoplites are armed, right? They've got their circular shield and they've got a sword probably with them on their belt, and they have a big long spear, right? And how does this phalanx thing work? They what? They stand in rows, okay. Okay. They what? They're all armed in the same way. Nicholas, what were you going to say? They all move kind of in sequence, or in concert, right? They all move together. And what's the sword and the spear arrangement? Yeah, everyone's got to work together. And so, oftentimes I think when we see, battles being fought, particularly in movies, newer movies, we see, guys running around and jumping with swords and hacking through people. But the Greek phalanx is a totally different thing. It's not kind of every man for himself. It's everybody has to work together, right? So everyone is kind of lined up in rows. Everyone's got their shield in front of them, and so the shield protects you, but the shield of the guy to your right protects your other side, and then you put your spear through the middle, right? And everyone stays together, keeps tight, and they push into the other group, right? And again, if you hold your formation and you work hard, then you can overcome the other group, right? But if you don't work together and you come apart, then it's all over, right? And so these phalanxes work like, big groups of guys that sort of push against each other with swords and shields until one group kind of manages to separate the other group, and then they start hacking them up with swords, kind of thing. How is this kind of way of fighting connected to this polis idea? Yeah, so the city-state is really relies on the efforts and the cooperation of its citizens, right? These city-states don't have what you would call a standing army, right? So here in Canada, we have a standing army. We have a military to protect us, right? If somebody invades us tomorrow, the Canadian government's not going to call me and tell me to go to war, right? We have a standing, thank God, we have a standing military. Canada would never. I'd never be able to defend the country. But we have a standing army to protect us, right? So we don't have to worry about that. But in the ancient world, most places don't have a standing army. If there's a threat, then the craftspeople and the merchants and the farmers, they all put down their tools and they pick up swords and they go to war, right? And so if your city-state is being attacked, it's not the military that will defend it. It is you who will defend it. Right? And so all of these people have to work together in order to not only make their city-state work and make it successful, but also to defend that city-state if it's being attacked, right? So everyone has to work together, right? Everyone has to cooperate in order to get the job done. It's not about individual glory, it's about working together, right? And so the city-state, the polis works that way, and the phalanx works that way as well. They mention in this section the major gods of ancient Greece, and who are they? Zeus, and what is he god of? Yeah, the weather. He's kind of the king of the gods, right? He's kind of the father figure of the gods, god of weather and thunder and the storm, right? That's all Zeus. Who else? Hera, who is Yeah, she's kind of yeah, she's kind of a goddess of women, if you will. So of motherhood, of the home, um, the family, things kind of in the domestic, the traditionally feminine domestic sphere. All of that is Hera, and she's Zeus's wife, right? Who else? Who? Poseidon, god of the sea. Yeah. Hermes. Yeah, trade and he's a messenger god as well. Hermes is. Who else? Who? Athena, right? Is the god of war and wisdom, which is an interesting combination. But there she is. Who else? Yeah, Ares is kind of the violent bloodlust version of war, right? Who else? Artemis. Yeah, goddess of the hunt and of the moon. Apollo, god of the, what's that? Yeah, Artemis and Apollo are twins, and Apollo is the god of the sun, right? Who else? Aphrodite, goddess of love. Who else? Hades. They don't mention Hades, but yeah, he's god of. Yeah, god of the underworld is Hades. Yeah, they don't mention him, do they? No, they don't. But that's okay. He's important. Who else? Demeter. Yeah, Demeter is kind of the goddess of the harvest. Yeah, of agriculture, if you will. Who else? There's one more that they mentioned that we're missing. Who? Nope, we got Artemis. Who? Yeah, Dionysus. Yeah, Dionysus is kind of the god of wine and drinking and partying. I think those are all the major ones, right? Did we miss anyone? Persephone is the daughter of Demeter. Yeah, she becomes the wife of Hades, right? In kind of a weird, not a weird myth, but in a myth. So I guess Persephone becomes kind of a goddess of the underworld as the wife of Hades. Who else? They're definitely more than this. These are the big ones though. The big 10 or 12. I think there's 12 of them. I think they're the main ones. Okay, and what's going on with cults and oracles here? Cults and oracles. Right, so there's even though some gods are more important in certain polis, there is this kind of, there are areas there, the gods are shared by all the Greeks, and the oracles are as well, right? And some of the cults are. What's kind of a cult? Because we have a negative connotation of the word cult in modern day, right? If you think of cult, you think of a bunch of crazy religious people, praying for the end of the world or something, right? That's what a modern cult is, but that's not what an ancient cult is. Yeah. So in the ancient world here, a cult is just a religious group that is, actually that was really well said, a religious group that's kind of dedicated to a particular god or a particular deity. So in modern terms, cults are kind of have a negative connotation. In the ancient world, they're just groups of religious people who worship one particular god, right? So there's lots of cults running, cults around, cults to Artemis, cults to Athena, cults to Ares, and what's the deal with oracles? What do oracles do? I think we've talked about this before, but Yeah, oracles are people who can speak for the gods, right? Who can answer questions that you um, might want to ask the gods, right? So they give you an example here of the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, and so you can go there and you can ask a question, right? And the oracle will answer you. Although apparently this oracle is given to, answering questions in riddles, which is sometimes difficult to interpret. But yeah, people ask these oracles, and even leaders of the community, right, would go to the oracle and ask, should we start a war with so and so, right, or should we set up a new colony here, right? So big questions were decided by leaders of the community, but they always checked with the oracle first to see what the gods said. Yeah.
Did you skip question
Did I skip question 2? No, I don't think so. We kind of covered that, right? Yeah, that was the cooperation thing. Well, the idea that the phalanx required the soldiers to cooperate with each other and work together, as did the polis. The polis required people to cooperate and work together as well to sort of.
Oh, so that's 1 and 2.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so here's an example of what some of these hoplites might have looked like. So depending on where you came from and the amount of money you had, what's that?
The left side is Spartan.
Yeah, so there's a Spartan here on the right.
Yeah, you have the shield is
Yeah, it would depend on a few things, right? Where you came from, but also, yeah, the amount of money you had might have to do with it too. The Spartans kind of famously wore red, but all hoplites in the Greek world had kind of a round shield, maybe with your family symbol or crest on it. Sometimes you could afford a fancy helmet, either just the one on your head or the full face helmet. You'd always have a spear. You'd usually have a sword, a short sword somewhere. You can see that guy's got one there. Because with that sword, then you can stab people, right? So you get in really close, and you're pushing back and forth against the other army, and then you can just pull out a sword and stick people if you get close enough. And then sometimes they had greaves as well, and greaves are those kind of shin guards. You can see the guy on the right wearing. What's that? Oh, sorry, I left. It is on the left. Jeez, why don't I know right and left? I'm trying to do it for the thing behind me, but it is the same way, but it's confusing me. Anyway, yeah, greaves, right? These little shin guards here. So this is kind of what it might have looked like. So lots of Greek soldiers. They're all armed with their shields and their greaves and their swords and their long spears. And basically they're like a prickly hedgehog, right? And so they've got all their spears pointed forward, and they're going to charge the neighboring group and try to push them off the battlefield or get them to break up and scatter. And once they scatter, then you chase them away, right? And then you can see the little flute player in the back too, right? There's a little guy playing the flute, not for musical enjoyment, but to keep everybody synchronized, right? To keep everybody marching in the same time, just like a modern day marching band, right? Yeah, so here's a different artistic rendition of it. And again, you can imagine how difficult it's going to be to kill those soldiers there's a lot of spears poking out of that group, right? They're like a porcupine. Yeah, but this is kind of the method in which they develop to go to war. And again, everyone's got to work together. Everyone's got to fight in defense of their city-state, because there is no standing army. If there's a threat, then the people have to take up weapons, right? There's no military to defend them. Yeah, so a little bit about self-sufficiency. We kind of talked about that. I guess the other thing we should mention too is that, you know, part of your citizenship requirement for your polis was military service, right? So again, if you wanted to be a citizen of Athens, for instance, and Athens was under threat, you didn't get to sit it out, right? Oh, I have a bad back, right? you didn't get to sit out. You had to go to serve in the military. You had to fight for your city-state. So citizenship, and in places like Athens, your right to vote and military service, all of those things were connected, right? You had to, you did all of them or you did none of them, right? So being involved in the military was an important part of what it meant to be part of the city-state. We talked about these gods here, Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and Hermes and Athena and Ares and Dionysus and Apollo and Artemis. They're worshipped all throughout the Greek world, but each polis has its own kind of patron god, right? So I think the textbook mentioned that Artemis was kind of the patron god of Sparta. Athena is the patron god of Athens. Every city-state is going to have its own god that takes care of the city. Talked about cults, that's good. We talked about oracles, also good. Oh, okay. Do we have enough time for this? Let me just check here. Let me just see. One second here. Right. Nope. Okay. So that's going to be enough for today. I have a short video to show you and then some other things to do, but we won't have enough time to get into it, so I'm going to end it there. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk about Greece and the birth of democracy, as it were. That's what we'll talk about. So have a nice afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow.